I want to talk about context today, and I'm going to frame this as a bit of a challenge. I often use scripture in my videos and my cases against Christianity to talk about how immoral or harmful or problematic or hypocritical this God or this religion is based off its own source material. And by far, the number one excuse or objection I get is just a Christian in the comments screaming, context. Now, sometimes context is an answer, and I like to defend that. I have gone out of my way in multiple videos to say, you know what, sometimes atheists or skeptics will bring this up and they're wrong. Here's the context, and that's why it does actually excuse this, and it's why we shouldn't bring it up as an issue. I've also had a few times where I've been corrected and I've had to accept that, and I no longer bring those excuses up. I was corrected on the Jesus and the fig tree, and I've taken it out of my arsenal for a long time now. And so there is sincerity coming from me on this, but I'm going to present to you today, hopefully just 20 if I don't get carried away, verses that you've all probably heard me talk about a lot, but the reason I keep bringing them up is because I still have yet to hear a good argument for them. I still have yet to have anyone give me the proper context in which this no longer becomes a major issue against this God or this religion. Now, you might just have an answer that says, okay, fine, Brandon, you got the context right, but it's God. He can do what he wants. Do you think you could do better? Who are you to judge? And all the other nonsensical things that I answer in this playlist here. But remember, I'm responding today because for each of these 20, I have had multiple Christians multiple times tell me that there's nothing wrong there, that it's simply because I don't understand the Bible, because I don't know the context. So this is your chance. Provide me with the correct context that all of a sudden makes this not problematic. And if I get a convincing answer on any of these, I will publicly address it and I will never bring up that verse again. Let's dive in. And again, a short apology for the fact that many of you have heard many of these many times. I cannot help myself. I simply have to start with the flood. There's a lot of issues in the first 5 chapters of Genesis, and I can save many of those for another video, original sin being one of them. But the flood, I think, is where we get to a point where I don't know what you could possibly tell me context-wise that is going to excuse this. Specifically Genesis 6:6, where we hear that God regrets making man. I talked about that a lot in my recent omniscient video. It doesn't make any sense for God to regret, but even if it is somehow just an emotion attached to what he knew was going to happen, but he had to why did he have to explain that part of it to me? He didn't. No one made him. No one made him create in the first place. No one made him destroy. No one made him give man such a sinful nature. No one made him curse generations after Adam and Eve. And definitely no one made him commit to saving 8 people and starting over again. So the common excuse is, hey, God is very involved in his creation. He cares. He's grieved. And he's given humanity a second chance. But it's not much of a second chance when all the rules are still the same. Aren't all of the descendants that come from Noah still under the original curse of Adam and Eve and original sin? This is something I haven't said before. A true second chance would be a new Garden of Eden, a new Adam and Eve, a new test to fail before sin is introduced into the world. So no, that excuse doesn't work. And reading in context about why God chose to destroy these people and why he saved this family of 8 and the fact that he regretted it, I simply see it as inexcusable unless the outcome had been different. If after the flood and we started over and we go through God's first genocide of many, everyone was righteous and turned towards the Lord, I would say, okay, at least it worked out. At least it made sense. At least maybe you could make an argument of the ends justifying the means, but it didn't. If anything, you could argue that things are worse because how many more people are on the earth that are so supposedly wicked and evil and deserving of hell and will go to hell? So what context am I missing there in my claim about the unfairness and immorality of God? Next, let's move on to Lot and his daughters. Let me read this particular verse to you, Genesis 19:8. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them what you like. So my issue here is that Lot offers his daughters to be raped. Call me crazy, I don't think this is a good thing. And you could say, well, Brandon, that's a description in the Bible about what one man did. You can't blame God for that, except that he did it to protect the angels. And you know what the angels didn't say? Don't do that, Lot. That's not good, Lot. Lot is never chastised for this. And another reason to see that this was good in God's eyes is because the angels still choose to save Lot. The whole point here is they're destroying all the wickedness in Sodom and Gomorrah. So here's the quick version. Lot was considered righteous by God. Lot offers his daughters for rape. Lot is still saved by the angels who are sent from God, showing that he is still righteous and not deserving to be destroyed like all the other terrible people. Children, they need to die. A father who gives up his own daughters, nah, he's good. But kill his wife on the way out because she looked back. Oh, and then we'll bless his line line after he gets raped by his daughters by making it the line that Jesus comes from. Yep, that all checks out. Some of these I'm going to be quicker with because I have entire videos dedicated to them, but my third one comes to us from Exodus 12, 29 through 30, but essentially this is the story about the 10th plague. All the plagues are problematic, but the 10th one, when we get into murdering the firstborn, is especially problematic because these are innocents. No, of course not every firstborn was a baby. That's not what that means. You could have a 40-year-old firstborn, but you also had kids. You also had babies. And we know that it wasn't just Pharaoh or the wicked Egyptian rulers. It was all of Egypt, including the slaves. The firstborn from the house of Pharaoh to the lowliest slave, you know what, even to the animals had to die. Now, not only is this incredibly problematic, but the Christian will point out the context of you don't understand, God's people were in captivity. Wait a second, God's people is another huge problem in your context. The very fact that God already has a chosen people group that he is standing up for against other people groups, who, by the way, both groups have done the same thing. Both groups enslaved and have been enslaved. There's no righteous group here. It's truly just chosen, not better. He's not standing up for the little guy or the most moral. He picked a side, and despite their behavior, he acted unjustly to protect them, just so he could, curse and kill them himself later on. So that part of the context is already a bit absurd, but it gets worse when you see that God is the one hardening Pharaoh's heart to even get all the way to a 10th plague. Pharaoh wanted to give up long before this, and yeah, sometimes it talks about Pharaoh's own heart being hardening, but oftentimes it talks about God hardening his heart, and we have the verse where God brags to Moses about this plan in the first place. If you want to cut through all the apologetic BS on this, see this video here. Again, when you can explain to me why some Egyptian slave who was suffering the same level as the Israelite slave had to lose their firstborn child to a curse from God, who had purposely intervened in the Pharaoh's free will to make the decision Pharaoh originally wanted to make to let these people go to end the earlier plagues, I promise I'll never bring it up again. I find it truly inexcusable. We could talk about slavery in general forever. So I'm going to cover 2 more instances of slavery in the Old Testament and 1 in the New Testament because, again, there's no context that gets you out of this, but here they are, and I'm going to be quick. Leviticus 25:44 through 46. You may buy male and female slaves from the nations around you. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property. That's lifelong chattel slavery, an endorsement from God. Explicit permission. I don't care if there's verses about how you can't kidnap a man. God's not saying to kidnap. He's saying straight up buy them. Someone else already did the dirty work of capturing them. Or they got themselves into this mess because of the debt society or whatever other thing you want to understand about the context of the day. It doesn't matter. God is saying these slaves already exist. They're in these other nations. You can't buy them from among you, but you can buy them from them. Not you need to go free them. Not this isn't right. Not your neighbor is sinning, but don't partake yourself. No, you may go and buy them, and guess what? They're property, and guess what? It's forever. I've heard every single apologetic that has ever and can ever be made about it, and every single one fails. So let's hear it. What is the context that fixes this? And the next one I'm going to bring up before you can jump to it and say, oh, there wasn't chattel slavery, it was all indentured servitude. You simply don't know your Bible. The indentured servitude you're talking about comes to us from Exodus 21, 2 through 6. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. So there is your difference. That is the Israelite indentured servant instead of slave. You have found a way to accept that and excuse it as part of the time and better than they starve to death. And this is no different than our modern prison system and everything else that is a complete false analogy. But the one thing you can't get away from in that verse is that if he is married during his time as a servant and has children during that time, the woman and the children become slaves for life to the master. They shall never go free. The indentured servitude laws protect only men. And once again, we have an example where you can become a slave or get a slave without kidnapping being involved. Just help your indentured servant get married. And then when he has a kid, you get to keep the wife and the kid. Oh, but there is an exception if you keep reading. The man, if he wants to be with his wife and kids, can choose to become a slave for life. He pierces his ear. It's this whole thing. And now the master gets to keep them all. So I'm well aware of the debt economy of the day. I'm well aware of the Israelite rule versus the the foreigner rule. I understand all of this context background, but I'm still reading about people being owned as property forever. What am I missing? Let's jump to 2 examples from Numbers, and then we'll do 2 from Dut, and then we'll move on past the Torah. But a lot happens in the Torah. We'll do a few other Old Testament verses, like from Kings and Samuel, and getting into Isaiah, Job, and then we will jump forward to the New Testament. Numbers 5:11 through 31. If a woman has made herself impure and is unfaithful to her husband, her abdomen will swell and her womb will miscarry. This was the ritualistic test that not only would prove if the woman was actually unfaithful, but would punish her by making her barren and or to miscarry should the curse reveal her actual actions. You can get all the additional context here in this video. I also cover a lot of the typical apologetic excuses. The biggest thing that I've seen the Christian argue for here is, well, it's not for sure that it would cause a miscarriage. I think that it is. But even if, best case scenario, the punishment for a woman who has been unfaithful is to be barren forever, let alone all of the trauma of going to the priest, having to drink this potion, which was essentially just an abortion mix that did Lord knows what to her reproductive system, if this was even true at all. But as it's recorded, this is what it looks like. By the way, when a man cheats, do you think he ever went through any kind of performance in front of a priest, getting shamed and having his reproductive process interrupted? Of course not. So this is sexist, this is unfair, and this is also God obviously not caring about the sanctity of life. Show me where I'm wrong. I mean, the real context for most of these, I guess I haven't done an excellent job of stating it, but like, for example, with this one, this is a ritual law of sorts to account for accusations that couldn't otherwise be proved to protect the patriarchy. This isn't some woke reinterpretation for me. This is a society that clearly has very different rules for men than women, ones that favor men and oppress women. If it was really about some kind of objective moral law, we would see this go both ways. The fact that we don't points even additionally to the context of the time and what we know about these kinds of tribes at the time. And by the way, that's the other part. If your answer to any of this is, well, that was just the context of the time, and you're applying this different, newer landscape, so much for the immutability of God, so much for his divine perfection. If God has to work within the confines of the time, then God's not all powerful. You supposedly serve an immutable God that is the steady rock foundation of what is good and what is not. The very fact that has obviously changed between Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant is incredibly problematic on its own, but it definitely means you don't get to utilize it as an objection to when I point out the obvious immorality with these issues. But our second one from Numbers, somehow I believe even worse, is Numbers 31:17 through 18. Now, kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. The context here is Moses ordering this under, again, God's protection as the leader of this people group against, in this case, the Midianites. Now, sometimes Christians will say this was just Moses saying it. We didn't hear it straight from God, but we hear the exact same thing from God in many other times. We also see when Moses goes rogue and he gets called out and punished to the highest degree. I think if this genocide and sexual slavery was not what God wanted, this would have been a better time to punish him than when Moses got angry at that rock one time. Contextually, it is apparent that God approves of this. There's other verses where God himself is the one demanding a portion of the spoils of war, and the spoils that are being talked about are the people and the animals, mentioned in the same sentence like that, to be divvied up amongst the men as booty. But the reason I like to point this one out, in addition to the ones that just talk about the genocide, is because it is so specific. Save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So you are killing 14-year-old brides that had already been married. You are killing grandmothers. You are killing grandfathers. You are killing little boys, babies, 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Obviously, you've killed all the fighting men. That would be the one thing that would be potentially excusable. But that 12-year-old that hadn't had a chance to be known yet in the biblical sense, or the 7-year-old, or the 3-year-old, these are the prizes for the men. And why do you think it was important that they were virgins? It's because they're sex slaves now, and they're worth more intact, enough to at least be spared, not treated well. Well, Brandon, later on we find out some of them were made wives. Oh, I just read a story not too long ago about a case of someone that abducted a young girl and forced her to marry him and then continued to rape her. All good? I didn't think so. And neither is this. Again, what context makes the original genocide okay? I'm sure you'll try to tell me something about the Midianites' God demanding child sacrifices. So what? You killed all the children? Every excuse I've ever heard for however you want to try to recontextualize this fails so utterly by what the Israelites themselves go on to do in all of these situations blessed by God. These people are so wicked, they're killing all the children, so we need to go and kill all their children. Okay, perfect logic. Let's move into Dute, and just sticking with the same theme of genocide instead of just sexual slavery. Dute 7:2, when the Lord God has delivered them over to you, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Now, the context here is that God doesn't want the Israelites to adopt pagan rituals or worship other gods. Not false gods, mind you, other gods. Sometimes it's false gods, sometimes it's idols, sometimes it's other gods. And if you understand the Canaanite pantheon that was going on at this time, the one that Yahweh himself is from, you'll understand the polytheistic nature of the belief of the Israelites at this time, before it really converts at the crossroads of the Babylonian captivity, where things start getting redacted a little bit into more of a monotheistic belief system, because of outside influence, by the way. So yeah, we don't want the incorrect God belief and worship of these other gods infiltrating us. So instead of just, I don't know, telling our people to worship the one true God, like we already have in the 10 Commandments, or giving them reason to only believe in one God, will help them genocide essentially anyone and everyone else who believes or thinks differently than them, so that that option is off the table, I guess. For a God of peace, love, justice, and mercy, who is specifically saying offer no peace, love, justice, or mercy, I find this incredibly hypocritical and immoral. If we move on to 21:18 through 21, if someone has a stubborn and rebellious son, all of the men of his town are to stone him to death. So here the issue, of course, is killing children for disobedience or being stubborn. You know, the way children will do. The context here is, of course, in this patriarchal society, we would never want to disrespect the paternal authority. So we're going to make some examples out of some kids until then, and we're going to make sure everyone sees it and everyone participates in it. Everyone loves the commandment, children, obey your father and your mother, but they never read the second part of it, which clearly says so that you may live a long life, because the punishment for not obeying them was death, ordained by God. What context am I missing? What context makes this better? And lastly, from this book, we'll go to 22:28 through 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the woman. Now, there's a lot of rules around rape, which you might think, hey, that's a good thing, except they don't fall under the other rules when we're protecting the inherent dignity of, say, the patriarchal man. They fall under property rights. Notice here, it has to be someone who is not engaged, because if someone is already promised to another man, that's a totally different problem. And sometimes we just have to go ahead and put her to death and her rapist, but also only if she doesn't persist or scream enough. And we could talk about all of those problems, but here the problem is very obvious. This was not a slight amongst the woman. Rape is not the issue here. It is the defiling of the man's property. Once again, the correct context to understand this in is the patriarchal society of the day, and the father here owns the daughter. He can sell her into slavery or into marriage, and to take away what made her valuable, her virginity, means that he would need to be compensated. And since he wouldn't be able to get money for her or get rid of her afterwards, an additional punishment was that the man would have to marry her. Can you imagine for 1 second if in our modern day law, when someone rapes someone, we just made them pay a fine and then forced the woman to marry her rapist? And yet this is what the perfect unchanging God of the Bible does. And just really quickly, let's do one more genocide so I can make another point. For Samuel 15:3, now go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them, men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. The context here is simple. The Amalekites wronged God generations ago, but God does not forget. So it's time that they get dealt with. Total genocide. And again, we could pull out genocide verses from so many places. I mean, we could have put the entire book of Joshua up here for grabs. But the reason that I wanted to pull this one is one of the other excuses that gets pulled out all the time is that of hyperbole. But as I've told all of you many times, and you can go and read it here for yourselves, the hyperbole excuse completely fails when Saul is dethroned for not following this to the letter of the law once he lets a few animals as well as the king live. So he kills 99.999% of all living things, but God literally meant 100, and that's why he's going to get a man after his own heart, David, that will do this the correct way, and that is the fall of Saul and the rise of David. You cannot tell me it was hyperbolic. It clearly wasn't. We know the context about this people group and why God chose was to have them dealt with. My question to you is, how do you excuse this? How is this good? How is this just? If you wouldn't excuse it today, what changed? Context? What context? What makes it ever okay? What made it okay for your God to do thousands of years ago, but no longer? These are literally answers I can't answer that, by the way, and maybe I haven't made this abundantly clear, I wanted to answer. It took me a good half decade to fully deconstruct and deconvert. All along, I was dealing with these very issues. These aren't gotcha questions to believers. These are the very things I could no longer justify when I was willing to take a real, honest look. But let's hear it. I'm going to give you a three-peat because I think these three, though all very similar and ones that I've probably talked about more than anything else, are so completely unjustifiable that I have to include them. But I also need to do it quickly because of how much I've covered them. First, you have God killing 70,000 men because David sinned. He did a census when he wasn't supposed to, and based off two different books who give two different accounts. One time it is God who is tempting him to do the census. Another time it is the devil. So we have a pure contradiction. Either way, we have a complete problem in whichever one of these you choose. And then we have a totally unjust punishment. David's life is never at stake in any of these three punishments that David is about to go through. David gets to choose, by the way, from three punishments in this particular situation, and he chooses the one that will affect him the least, and 70,000 people in Israel die. And actually, God has to relent a little bit. The angel is getting bloodthirsty and is about to destroy all of Jerusalem, and then God's like, okay, I think we're good at 70,000. Give me the context in which that is just. I'm waiting. Seriously. Why would anyone need to die for a census being taken, first of all? Yet alone, someone that had nothing to do with it, let alone 70,000 of them. David, punishment number two that happens, and the next two have to do with his sin with Bathsheba. And again, it's always other people paying the price. God kills David's infant son. It takes him 7 days to do so. That means the child is sick and suffering for 7 days while David is going through these motions of fasting and begging God to change his mind. And God doesn't. He kills the kid. How is killing a baby a just punishment for the father's sin? Generational punishment in general could be on this list. Here's a video for that. Explain this one to me. Seriously, I've brought this up in, 17 of my 300 videos, and I have never even had someone attempt to explain to me why this was okay. I think one time someone said, it's probably okay that baby's having a better life in heaven now, but nothing about why that would be a just punishment in the first place. Same thing with this next one. Literally, no one's ever touched it. Let's hear it. I'll just read this one so we're more clear. Out of your household, I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives, multiple, I believe this would have been 7 or 8 at this point, and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. God endorses, orders rape of multiple women in public as a punishment for a man's adultery. What did I get wrong? What context am I missing? What context fixes this? Anybody? Okay, moving past the David stuff, let's do a few more in the Old Testament here. I covered the story of Elijah not that long ago. And just one of the problematic parts of that is after God answers the test of proving himself to the prophets of Baal, Elijah takes them to the river and slaughters them. And again, we hear nothing from God. And with the anointing that was on Elijah, there's no reason to believe that God wasn't in favor of this. In fact, right after this, Elijah goes on the run and God is whispering in his ear, comforting, literally is sending an angel to actually bake him cakes to nourish him. Does that sound like God is upset about the actions of the 450 slaughtered? I don't think so. And then after that, he goes on to give Elijah the power to just kill 50 messengers at a time with fire from heaven a few times in a row. Explain that. Either one, take your pick. Make it make sense. Now, call me old-fashioned. I guess that I'm really kind of harping on all the baby death and forced rape, but we see both of that in Isaiah 13:16. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. Now, to be fair, this is a prophecy of judgment against Babylon. Now, we have some problems with the very fact that a lot of God's prophecies are conditional on what the people do. But if it goes a certain way, what is God absolutely okay with, whether it actually happens or not? These things. And since we've seen him do these things on his own punishment, like the two examples I just gave you from David, we have no reason to not believe this or to think that it's exaggeratory or hyperbolic. My favorite one that people love to scream context at me is all the times that we will bring up Isaiah 45:7, where God says that he creates evil. Well, Brandon, if you actually understand that word was calamity, and at that time in the Hebrew, what calamity actually meant, and yada, 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 and no, you're wrong. You're just wrong. Here's a video where I go through the Hebrew. We look at other verses that use the same Hebrew in the same way, as if you even need any of this to say that an all-powerful God who created something when no one made him and had all the foreknowledge and all the power, and we have a world with evil in it, didn't create evil. You don't get to say that. Of course he created evil. You can't say your God is the creator of everything, but it doesn't work. Of course he's the creator of evil. Of course that's what this verse means. Try to tell me your God, who was there outside of time and creation, the beginning and the end, the omnipotent, somehow created perfection and evil crept in. Explain how that makes sense. And let's end the Old Testament with Job. I don't care if you want to say it's a metaphor, or you want to say that it's hyperbole, or you want to say that it's different because he's a non-Israelite, or what. Here's the facts quickly. Job was perfectly righteous. The accuser, however you want to interpret that being Satan to be, comes before God that he has access to in the heavenly council. Essentially, and I know that it's a bit pedantic to put it this way, but I don't see how it's not, makes a bet with God that he can get Job to not be righteous anymore, to turn on God. Does God say, no, we would never test that? No, he says, yeah, let's do it. And he gives his express permission, which he had to give in order for Job to do what he had to do, which was kill servants, kill livestock, kill children, and torture Job. Is killing children wrong? Can I just get a read on this? Would the Christian say yes or no? Is the answer from you, yes, it's wrong unless God does it? I've heard Christians literally talk about how the devil killed these children and that's bad. But then I point out to them, well, he only did it after God told him he could, and he couldn't have done it without God's permission. So it's really like God killed him. And all of a sudden, it's not bad anymore. Isn't that amazing? That's a pretty cool magic trick. And it happens with no context needed. Is that your answer for all of this? All of the things I've brought up, they're just all of a sudden okay as long as God does it? Could you just be honest and say that that's as far as you're willing to think about things, divine command theory? That you have no expectation of God holding himself to his own standard or being a good display for us or being consistent with his morality? Because if so, just say it and stop yelling context. The very fact that children are just treated replaceable in this story goes to show how little inherent dignity God is putting on kids or people at all. But that's the God of the Old Testament. Things have gotten better. Jesus came. We got a new covenant. None of this should be a problem anymore. Who cares about the immutable nature of God? Who cares about objective morality? We've got something new. 2.0. Forget Judaism. We've got Christianity now. Here's some verses I still need explained to me from the New Testament. Matthew 5:28. Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I need someone to explain thought crime to me. We know a lot about the brain. We know about impulses, and we know about thoughts, and we know that we don't choose what we think about. We might choose what we continue to think about. We might make actions based off that decision. We might ruminate in our head about something once it's been brought to our attention, but I could get you to think about anything right now just by mentioning it. And you might choose to focus on it or not, to meditate on it or not, to act on it or not. But you are not responsible for your thoughts, and definitely not to the same degree as acting on them. You're telling me you're good with your God, the God of wrath and punishment, equating actual adultery with lust. If so, I've just got one question for the guys here. If you're a married Christian man, please go and confess to your wife that you have had an affair. If you've had a lustful thought and you're a Christian man, please go and beg for forgiveness and ask her not to leave because of the affairs you've been having. When you do that, I'll know that you're taking this seriously. But if not, then you too are agreeing with me that there is a delta so wide between the action and the thought. And a God who can't see that delta and judges these things the same, which by the way is an incredibly harsh judgment, as we'll get to in our next verse, might not be all that perfectly moral or perfectly just. What do you think? So as for how seriously that God takes sin, let's hear from Jesus himself. Matthew 5:29-30. If your right eye causes you to stumble, get out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Jesus is warning that there is a consequence that is extremely severe, and that because of the severity of the consequence, whatever you believe it to be, you need to take sin, even lust in the thought. Again, it's referencing back to the eye because that's what you see with, that's what you lust with. Better to just tear it out. And sure, maybe that's hyperbole. But even metaphorically, this is still insanely extreme, and it's still fear-based. It's still commanding obedience out of fear. If even hyperbolically, it's better to dismember your body than go on to sin because of the dire consequences of sin, whatever they might be, then this doesn't look like the God of love. It looks like the God of punishment. We have more like this that are going to fall into the same category, so we'll go through a few of these quick, like Matthew 10:34 through 35. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. In a similar fashion, Matthew 14:26 through 27. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and child, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. So you want to argue both of these are hyperbolic? Fine. He doesn't mean a sword. He just means division. He doesn't mean hate. He just means love less. I'll give it to you. 1,000 times over, I'll give it to you. And I still find these verses absolutely disgusting. What God of love who places people in our life for us to love, these supposed holy, special relationships. I mean, he compares a bride for what the church is of Jesus. This is not some light thing, but we're supposed to put our own spouses down. We're supposed to respect our parents so much that the penalty for not doing so is death, being stoned to death by all the men of the tribe, and yet we should hate or love less mother and father. So what is Jesus saying here? The Christian says, oh, it's clear. Yeah, no, I mean, respect these people, love them, but ultimately your first priority needs to be Jesus. Why do we even have to make distinctions? Why doesn't loving Jesus automatically raise up all love for everyone else? Why do you sing Christmas songs about the Prince of Peace when Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace. I came with my sword, or division, whatever you want to call it to minimize it. And haven't we seen that? And it's horrendous. Families completely torn apart because they take seriously verses like this. So when their child is acting in a way that they don't approve of or living a lifestyle they don't agree with, they can rest on these verses when they completely cut them out of their life. They can justify their emotional, mental, and sometimes physical abuse of their family members because they need to put Jesus as the priority. These verses do way more harm than good. They're completely unnecessary. And again, wouldn't it be great if just for once God was bringing everyone up with him and not causing separation and having to put others down to show your devotion? Can you just imagine for a second that I tell this to my kids? Let's just pick my daughter. Hey, listen, as the patriarch of this family, as the most important person to you, I need to see that. I need to feel that. So I'm going to allow you to still have a relationship with your mom and with your brother, but you better show me that you're willing to be at odds with them. Maybe that just means you love them less. Maybe you need to kick them out of your life. Whatever it is, it needs to be diminished with them so it can be raised up with me. I would be a monster. Here's one, John 9, 1 through 3. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. This is referencing Jesus heals a blind man. Here's the context. His followers ask him, who sinned to cause this blindness? Was it this person or his father? So again, for people that like to scream context, I've never heard Christians talk about all of this behind the scenes stuff. They just talk about how great it is when God heals the blind. And yet we have three main problems with this verse because of the context. The disciples, first of all, rightly assume that it's one of those two first options because those are the penalties. That's how people are harmed. Physical ailments are results of sin, and sometimes they're your sin, and sometimes because of, again, generational punishment, they're the sins of the father. So since they know their Bible well, they've been reading their Torah, they say to their teacher, well, which is it? And in typical Jesus fashion, he usurps Father God Yahweh, who he was also there with when he said those original things. And he says, no, you have it all twisted. In this case, this man has been born blind for my glory, for me, in this moment, to heal him. I'm not sure which of those three things is sicker. Being blind your whole life as some kind of payment for a sin you did when you were a baby? Your original sin demands blindness? Being blind because your father sinned? Or being born blind so that decades later, Jesus can have this 30-second moment, which he's already had a ton of, just to bring himself glory? If this isn't the truest telling of the nature of Jesus, we are playthings, we are chess pieces, we are collateral damage on the road to God's ultimate glory. How disgusting. What did I get wrong? I'm sorry, what context am I missing to excuse any of that? 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 14. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. The Christian will often go ahead and add context for us that's not true. They'll say, hey, listen, you're not understanding in context. This is Paul writing to one church. There was a problem going on with that church. They act like they were there, like they know. And he's addressing a group of particular women. Let me read the next line from the verse. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. That's his thought process. That's the reasoning behind this verse. You don't get to claim incorrect context that you made up about it being a singular church issue for a group of individuals. You need to read your own context and hear straight from the horse's mouth why he is making this delineation. And it is because women are less than men. They are to be trusted less than men because they were the first and only ones deceived. Where am I wrong? But let's end with New Testament slavery because that's always fun. 1 Timothy 6:1-2, and we can see this also in Ephesians and Galatians. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. 1, I don't think you can be devoted to the welfare of something you own as property. 2, the idea that you should treat someone at all better, let alone a master, because they're a Christian, is the in-group out-group that causes so much harm. And it's seen all over the Bible, not just in this passage. And 3, this shows us clear as day that slavery by Christian masters was completely accepted, expected, and permitted. Now, the context that gets thrown at me when I bring up verses like this is, well, you don't understand what was going on in the Greco-Roman world at the time. They had slaves in the home, and it would have been a big disruption to have a slave revolt. It would have actually gotten in the way of the conversion that was going on amongst the Romans at this time. And so, the warnings going out to these slaves is, hey, don't make trouble for the greater good of Christ. Did I get your excuse right? Because other than that, I don't know how you justify this. And the reason why I don't accept this as a valid excuse is because Paul is a disruptor. He calls for things to be called out and changed all the time. He is upending ideas and churches and Jewish law and custom all over the place. The reason he's not calling this out is because it wasn't an issue to him. If you can't have Christianity without people being owned as slaves, you shouldn't have Christianity. So I'll say it one last time. Where am I wrong? What context don't I have for any and all of these verses? And if you're able to catch me on one, great. But you've got like 22, 23, 24 in front of you that if even one of them is without excuse, I think it absolutely points to an immoral, inconsistent, hypocritical, evil God. If he were real. Again, this is an internal critique. Again, not trying to be a jerk. I know I get passionate. I get passionate about hypocrisy. I get passionate about a religion that 2 billion people believe in and orient their life around and continue to indoctrinate and pass down, that infiltrates at all levels of society. And so it matters. And this is the source material for the entire thing. This is the God you're worshiping. These are the values and objective morals that you are trying to continue to put in place and rule and reign by. I think first we should step back and say, were they good? Were they consistent? Is this God true? Can his nature be correct if these other things are also true? And when I try to point that out, the wave of context comes at me. So I present to you my case and I await the correct context. But I'll see you Tuesday with another video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris, GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn; my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Lisa, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.